The penthouse was a cathedral of glass and cold, gray marble, perched so high above the city that the sirens below sounded like a distant, dying choir. Michael Ward sat in a chair of hand-stitched Italian leather that cost more than most men made in a year. The leather was supple, yielding, and entirely devoid of warmth, much like Michael himself. He smoothed the crease of his charcoal suit trousers, the fabric a blend of silk and wool that felt like a second skin, a polished suit of armor for a man who had traded the mud of the battlefield for the sterilized air of high finance. To the world, Michael was a success story of the private sector, a consultant for risk management. To the few who knew the truth, he was a ghost who had walked out of the smoke of a dozen different war zones and decided to stop feeling. He had spent years mastering the art of the empty room. Even when he was in it, he wasn't really there. He had refined his life down to a series of high-end surfaces, the glint of a Swiss watch, the silent hum of the climate control, and the love nothing, feel nothing philosophy that acted as a silent sentry at the gates of his mind. He poured 3 fingers of Highland peat into a crystal tumbler. The liquid was amber and honest. It burned the throat, a solitary reminder that he was still a creature of flesh and blood. Michael watched his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked like a king of industry, but he knew the truth. The expensive suit was just a more socially acceptable way to hide the scars. Underneath the pristine white cuff of his shirt, a jagged line of silver tissue wrapped around his wrist, a souvenir from a botched extraction in a city whose name he had tried to forget. He liked the silence. Silence didn't ask questions. Silence didn't scream for help. He had built these thick walls not just to keep the world out, but to keep the echoes of his past muffled. In this world of luxury, there were no monsters under the bed. There were only quarterly reports, offshore accounts, and the steady, rhythmic ticking of a life lived in a vacuum. He was safe here. He was invisible. The burner phone on the desk. A relic from his former life that he kept out of a habit he couldn't quite break, was an eyesore against the polished mahogany. It sat there, black and utilitarian, a blunt instrument in a room of surgical precision. It was supposed to be dead. It was supposed to stay silent, a tombstone for the man he used to be. Then, the vibration came. It wasn't a ringtone, it was a low, aggressive thrum that rattled the crystal glass on the desk. Michael didn't move. He didn't breathe. He watched the device as if it were a live grenade. In his world, a message on that phone never meant good news. It meant a debt was being called in, or a ghost had finally found his address. He set the glass down. The movement was slow, deliberate, the muscle memory of a man who never hurried because hurry led to mistakes. He reached out, his large, calloused hand looking out of place against the delicate light of the office, and flipped the phone over. The blue light of the screen hit his eyes, cold and piercing. It cut through the carefully curated shadows of his penthouse, shattering the peace he had spent millions to maintain. He read the text. Then he read it again. The ghost in the suit felt a sudden, violent crack in his armor. The apathy he used as a shield didn't just flicker, it vanished. Michael stood up. He didn't look at the scotch. He didn't look at the view. He began to unbutton the Italian jacket, dropping it to the floor without a second thought. The luxury no longer mattered. The silence was over. The blue light of the smartphone screen stayed reflected in Michael's pupils, searing the image of the boy's terrified face into his retinas. He stared at the jagged, frantic typing. The misspelling of the words wasn't just a lack of grammar, it was the physical manifestation of a hand shaking so hard it could barely find the keys. It was a trembling desperation he recognized with a sickening familiarity. It was the rhythm of a heart beating against the ribs like a trapped bird. Michael's thumb hovered over the glass. His internal architecture, the cold, reinforced concrete of his "love nothing" mantra, began to groan under the weight of the notification. "Not my problem," the mercenary whispered in the back of his mind. "Wrong number. Delete. Reset." He had spent years refining his apathy, turning his soul into a fortress where the cries of the world were muffled by the height of his penthouse. To engage was to break the seal. To reply was to invite the chaos of the living back into his sterile tomb. But the eyes in the photo wouldn't let him go. They were wide, reflecting the faint glow of the phone in that dark closet, framed by the sleeves of winter coats. They were a mirror. Michael looked down at his own hands, the same hands that had gripped rifles in the rain and signed off on collateral damage. He saw the silver scar on his wrist and felt the phantom weight of a smaller hand he hadn't held tightly enough 20 years ago. The ghost of his brother, David, didn't scream, he just stared with those same trusting, doomed eyes. The logic of the soldier tried to take command. He didn't know the address. He didn't know the threat. But he knew the monster. He knew the type of man who hunted children in the dark, and he knew that for a child to reach out to a stranger, the system had already turned its back. If Michael stayed in this chair, sipping his scotch, he wasn't just a retired soldier, he was an accomplice to the repeat of his own greatest failure. He felt the iron fist of his old self clenching inside his chest. The apathy wasn't a shield anymore, it was a cage. He looked at the time, 11:44 p.m. Every second he spent debating his soul was a second the intruder spent closing the distance to that closet door. The air in the office felt stagnant, tasting of dust and dead dreams. He needed the air of a hunt. He needed to be the thing that the monsters feared. His pulse, usually a steady 50 beats per minute, began to climb, a tactical drumbeat thumping in his ears. He wasn't a businessman anymore. The charcoal suit trousers and the silk shirt felt like a shroud. He moved to the hidden wall safe, his fingers dancing across the keypad with a speed born of 1,000 drills. The door hissed open, revealing the matte black hardware of his true profession. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the encrypted burner and traced the signal. It was a residential area, 12 blocks away. Through the city traffic at this hour, it was a 4-minute drive. He would have to do it in 2. Michael typed the reply, his movement surgical and final. There was no comfort in his words, only the cold promise of a professional. Lock the door, he sent, the blue bubble of the message floating into the void. I'm 2 minutes away. As he stepped into the private elevator, the ghost in the suit was gone. The Guardian was already calculating wind speed, entry points, and the most efficient way to break a man's spirit. The clock was ticking toward midnight, and for the man at the other end of that text, the devil was coming. The private elevator descended with a gut-wrenching drop, but Michael didn't feel the shift in pressure. His mind was already 3 miles ahead, mapping the grid of the city like a digital overlay across his vision. When the doors slid open to the subterranean garage, the silence was shattered by the predatory growl of a modified black SUV. He didn't just get into the car, he became part of the machine. He threw the vehicle into gear, the tires screaming against the polished concrete as he launched into the night. The city was a smear of neon and rain-slicked asphalt. Streets that usually felt like a labyrinth now opened before him as he drove with a cold, kinetic fury. Lights blurred past in long, golden ribbons, streaks of amber and red that bled into the periphery of his vision. He wasn't seeing the storefronts or the late-night pedestrians. He was seeing lanes of opportunity and tactical gaps. He moved through traffic like a scalpel through silk, the needle on the speedometer climbing into the red. Every red light was a suggestion he ignored, every corner a calculated drift that kept his momentum surging forward. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ozone and the rhythmic thud of his own heart. Michael reached into the passenger seat, his hand finding the heavy, textured weight of his tactical vest. With one hand on the wheel and his eyes locked on the road, he began the ritual. It was a mechanical prayer. He pulled the vest over his head, the ceramic plate settling against his chest with a dull thud, the iron fist finding its grip. He tightened the straps until the breath in his lungs felt measured and sharp. The transition was total. The ghost in the suit had been stripped away, replaced by a predator that had spent a lifetime studying the geography of violence. He checked the sidearm, the slide racking with a metallic clack-clack that sounded like a death knell in the confined space. He wasn't Michael Ward, the risk consultant, anymore. He was a weapon being unsheathed. His breathing slowed, falling into the tactical rhythm. Deep, nasal inhales and controlled exhales that lowered his cortisol and sharpened his focus to a razor's edge. He could feel the buried grief trying to surface, the memory of his brother's face threatening to blur his concentration, but he pushed it down into a dark corner of his mind. He couldn't afford to be a grieving man. He had to be a ghost. He had to be the shadow that arrived before the scream. The GPS chirped, a cold electronic pulse signaling the final turn. The residential neighborhood appeared, a row of quiet, unsuspecting houses where the porch lights flickered like dying stars. Somewhere behind one of those doors, a child was counting his heartbeats in a dark closet, and a monster was breathing down the hallway. Michael killed the headlights 2 blocks early. The SUV coasted in a ghostly, silent roll, the engine purring like a cat in the tall grass. He didn't use the brakes until the last possible second, bringing the heavy vehicle to a halt in the shadows of an overgrown oak tree. He checked the watch. 1 minute and 58 seconds since the text. He stepped out of the car, the door closing with a click that was no louder than a snapped twig. The night air was cold, smelling of damp earth and the distant iron of a coming storm. He didn't run, he moved with a fluid, predatory grace, his boots barely touching the pavement. He was a shadow moving through shadows, a nightmare coming to end a nightmare. The 2 minutes were up, and Michael Ward had arrived to collect the debt. The front door groaned under the pressure of Michael's lockpick, a soft metallic sigh that was swallowed by the low rumble of thunder in the distance. He slipped inside, a shadow merging with shadows. The air hit him like a physical blow, heavy, thick, and rancid. It was a cocktail of neglect he'd smelled in 100 different failed states, the sour tang of stale beer, the metallic sharp of fresh blood, and the pungent, unmistakable musk of adrenaline and fear. This wasn't just a house anymore, it was a kill zone. Michael didn't turn on a light. He didn't need to. He moved with a predatory fluidity, his weight distributed so perfectly that the old floorboards didn't even dare to creak. He was a ghost in a tactical vest, his eyes scanning the gloom through the green-tinted clarity of his peripheral vision. To his left, an overturned chair, to his right, a broken lamp. The system had indeed failed here long before tonight, leaving only the wreckage of a life and the smell of a predator who thought he was alone. He could hear it then, the sound of the hunter. Heavy, arrogant footsteps thudded on the second floor. It wasn't the movement of a man afraid of being caught, it was the slow, rhythmic stomp of a man who enjoyed the terror he inspired. Thud. Thud. The intruder was taking his time, savoring the stalk. Michael felt a cold, familiar fire ignite in his gut. He had spent his career hunting men like this, men who mistook the silence of the vulnerable for a lack of protection. Michael reached the base of the stairs. He could hear a voice now, a low, gravelly rasp that dripped with a terrifying, false intimacy. "I know you're in here, Ollie," the voice crooned, followed by the wet sound of a bottle hitting a carpet. "Hide and seek is over. Don't make me get angry." Each word was a serrated blade against Michael's nerves. He began his ascent, moving along the wall where the structural support was strongest, his boots making less sound than a heartbeat. He was the worst monster, coming out of the basement, a nightmare designed to devour the one currently prowling the hallway. He reached the landing and paused. The smell of blood was stronger here, mingling with the scent of a cheap, floral detergent. A mother's desperate attempt to keep a home clean in the middle of a war zone. He saw a smear of red on the doorframe of the master bedroom, but his focus stayed on the far end of the hall. There, a closet door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of light from a phone dying behind the wood. The intruder, a mountain of a man named Silas Vane, stood silhouetted against the window at the end of the hall. He held a heavy wrench in one hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. He was leaning in toward the closet, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floor, looking like a literal beast from a child's nightmare. Michael didn't draw his weapon yet. A gunshot was too quick, too merciful for a man who hunted children. He wanted Silas to feel the shift in the room. He wanted the predator to realize, in his final moments, that he had accidentally wandered into the cage of something much higher on the food chain. Michael stepped into the faint light of the hallway. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He simply exhaled, a slow, controlled release of air that sounded like the hiss of a coiled viper. The hallway felt like it was under a vacuum, the air pulled tight by the gravity of Silas Vane's presence. The intruder didn't notice the shadow behind him yet. He was too drunk on his own power, too focused on the trembling wooden slats of the closet door. Silas leaned in, his shadow swallowing the door whole. He smelled of sweat and cheap cigarettes, a scent that seemed to seep into the very wood of the house. "You're making this so much harder, Ollie," Silas whispered. The voice was a jagged rasp, the sound of gravel grinding in a blender. He tapped the heavy iron wrench against the doorframe. Clink, 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 a rhythmic psychological torture designed to break whatever was left of a child's spirit. "You know what happens when I have to look for things. I get impatient. And when I'm impatient, I get loud." Inside the closet, there was a muffled, hitching sob, the sound of a child trying to swallow their own breath. It was a sound that hit Michael like a physical strike to the chest, cracking the thick walls he'd spent years reinforcing. This was the moment of the fragile wings meeting the iron fist. Silas chuckled, a wet, rattling sound that ended in a cough. "Is your mama in there with you?" Silas asked, his voice dropping to a terrifying, mocking coo. "She's real quiet now, isn't she? Maybe she's just tired. Maybe you're the only one left to play." He reached out. His hand was a slab of scarred meat, fingers thick and stained, moving with agonizing slowness toward the brass handle. To Ollie, that hand must have looked like the claw of a god. The tension in the hallway reached a screaming pitch, a wire pulled so tight it was vibrating on a frequency only a soldier could hear. Michael watched the intruder's muscles coil, the casual arrogance of a predator who believed he was the apex of this dark ecosystem. Silas's fingers brushed the cold metal of the knob. He gripped it, his knuckles turning white. He didn't just want to open the door. He wanted to rip it off its hinges, to shatter the last barrier between his malice and the boy's innocence. "Found you," Silas hissed. He began to turn the handle. The mechanism clicked, a sharp, final sound that signaled the end of the wrong number and the beginning of the extraction. The door creaked open an inch, revealing a sliver of darkness and the faint, blue glow of a phone screen that had finally gone dark. But Silas never got to finish the turn. A hand, cold as the marble in Michael's penthouse and twice as hard, clamped onto Silas's shoulder. The intruder froze. In that heartbeat, the roles reversed. The predator felt the sudden, terrifying pressure of a grip that didn't just hold him, it weighed him. Silas tried to pivot, his eyes wide and bloodshot, but he was moving through honey while Michael was moving through light. The surgical, professional silence of the room was about to be broken. Michael Ward didn't look like a man in a suit anymore, he looked like the inevitable consequence of a lifetime of bad choices. The closet door stayed ajar, but the monster was no longer looking in. He was looking up, staring into the dead, gray eyes of a man who had come back from the grave to keep a promise. The transition from hunter to prey happened in the space between two heartbeats. Silas Vane attempted to swing the heavy wrench, a desperate, wide arc fueled by a sudden, primitive surge of adrenaline. But Michael wasn't where the blow landed. He moved with the economy of a ghost, a blur of charcoal fabric and tactical precision. He stepped into Silas's guard, his hand snapping out like a viper to catch the intruder's wrist. The sound of bone meeting a reinforced grip was a dull, sickening crunch. The wrench clattered to the floor, forgotten. Michael didn't use a firearm. A bullet was an impersonal ending, and tonight required a reckoning. He drove a palm into Silas's sternum, a strike delivered with enough kinetic energy to collapse a lung, sending the mountain of a man reeling back against the hallway wall. The house shuddered under the impact. Silas gasped, his eyes bulging as he tried to process the reality of the shadow standing before him. He saw the expensive Italian leather of Michael's shoes and the matte black ceramic of the tactical vest, a terrifying juxtaposition of wealth and war. Who are you?" Silas wheezed, blood flecking his cracked lips. He tried to reach for a knife tucked into his waistband, his movements clumsy and panicked. Michael didn't answer. He didn't have to. He was the physical manifestation of every debt Silas had ever run from. As Silas lunged, Michael caught the man's head, his movements surgical and professional, and drove it into the doorframe with a sound like a splitting melon. He followed with a series of rhythmic, foundational strikes, short, brutal punctuations of justice that didn't just neutralize the threat, they dismantled it. This wasn't a fight, it was an extraction of a cancer. Michael's face remained a mask of stone, his breathing shallow and controlled, even as he systematically broke the man who had dared to haunt a child's closet. He was the worst monster Silas would ever encounter, a predator who didn't kill for pleasure, but for the cold, absolute necessity of protection. Silas slumped to the floor, a heap of broken arrogance and fading consciousness. He looked up, his vision blurring, seeing only the silhouette of a man who looked like he belonged in a boardroom but moved like he was born in a trench. Michael stood over him, his shadow towering, his hands steady and unstained. The iron fist had done its work. The hallway, once thick with the stench of Silas's malice, now felt scrubbed clean by the sudden, violent intervention of a professional. Michael didn't spare a second glance for the man on the floor. The justice was done. The guardian remained. He turned his back on the fallen monster, his focus shifting instantly from the destruction of a threat to the preservation of a life. The silence that followed was heavy, no longer filled with the sound of a hunter's footsteps, but with the quiet, expectant air of a promise kept. The worst monsters had met their match, and for the first time in 20 years, Michael Ward didn't feel like a ghost. He felt like a shield. The violence had ended as abruptly as it began, leaving a silence so profound it felt like the house itself was holding its breath. Michael stood in the center of the hallway, his chest rising and falling in the slow, rhythmic cadence of a man who had successfully descended from a state of war. He didn't look at the broken shape of Silas Vane at his feet. Instead, he turned toward the closet door, which hung slightly ajar, a dark mouth in the pale light of the hall. He moved toward it, but his footsteps were different now. The predatory glide was gone, replaced by something softer, a hesitant grace he hadn't used in 2 decades. He knelt on one shadowed knee, making himself small, shedding the terrifying aura of the mercenary until only the man remained. "Ali," he said. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of the jagged edge that usually defined his speech. It was the sound of a steady hand in a storm. "It's over. He can't hurt you anymore." The closet door creaked further. A small, pale hand gripped the wood, the knuckles white and trembling. Then, slowly, a face emerged from behind the row of winter coats. The boy was smaller than Michael had imagined, a fragile bird lost in the dark. His face was streaked with tears and dust, and his chest was heaving with the remnants of a terror that didn't know how to let go. Then Ali looked up, and Michael felt the air leave his lungs. The boy had trusting eyes. Wide, hazel pools that flickered with a desperate, burgeoning hope. In the dim light, they were a perfect, haunting mirror of the eyes Michael saw every time he closed his own. They were the eyes of David, the brother he hadn't been fast enough to save, the ghost that had driven him into the cold luxury of his penthouse. For 20 years, Michael had lived in a world where those eyes were always closing, always fading into the dark. But here, in this hallway, they were open. They were looking at him. Did you get my message? Ollie whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. Michael reached out, his large, scarred hand hovering in the air before gently resting on the boy's shoulder. The contact was electric, a grounding wire for two souls lost in the dark. I got it, Michael said, his own voice thick with an emotion he had tried to bury under layers of silk and stone. I told you I was 2 minutes away. I don't break my word. Ollie didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into the touch, a sob finally breaking through his lips, not a sob of fear, but of profound, bone-deep relief. He surged forward, burying his face in the tactical vest Michael still wore. The ceramic plates were hard and cold, but to the boy, they were the safest place in the world. Michael closed his eyes, his hand cupping the back of the boy's head. The thick walls around his heart didn't just crack, they came down in a silent landslide. He wasn't a mercenary. He wasn't a ghost in a suit. He was a protector, standing guard over a life that was still whole. He had come here to finish a job, but as he held the trembling child, he realized he had finally come home. He had missed the appointment with his brother 20 years ago, but he was exactly on time for Ollie. I'm here, Michael whispered into the boy's hair, the words a sacred vow. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. The aftermath was not a matter of panic, but of protocol. Michael moved with a cold, quiet efficiency, his mind shifting from the heat of combat to the sterile precision of logistics. While Ollie sat wrapped in a blanket on the living room sofa, eyes fixed on the man who had appeared like a shadow and acted like a god, Michael was already on his phone. This was the cleanup, the invisible part of his trade where he erased the mess of the world and rewrote the future. He didn't call 911. He called a private number that didn't appear on any public registry. Within minutes, the quiet street outside was visited by two unmarked black vans. These were not the police, they were specialists, men who worked in the white spaces of the law, paid for with the wealth Michael had accumulated in his years of risk management. A medical team, discreet and professional, moved into the house. They didn't ask questions about the broken man being loaded into a different van in the driveway, nor did they flinch at the state of the master bedroom. They focused entirely on Ollie and his mother, providing a level of care that the city's overstretched public clinics could never dream of. Michael stood by the window, his silhouette sharp against the glass, watching as the system that had failed this family was replaced by a private safety net of his own making. They're going to be okay, a medic whispered as they finished stabilizing Ollie's mother. Michael nodded once, his face a mask of granite, but his eyes stayed on the boy. He opened an encrypted app on his burner phone, his fingers moving with surgical speed. He wasn't just fixing the night, he was fixing the next 50 years. With a few keystrokes, he authorized the creation of an anonymous trust. It was a fortress of capital, shielded by 3 layers of offshore shells, designed to provide for Ollie's education, housing, and medical needs until he was an old man. To the banks, it would look like a clerical ghost. To Ollie, it would be the invisible hand that ensured he would never have to hide in a closet again. He then pulled up a file on Silas Vane. By the time the sun rose, Silas would be processed through a legal channel that Michael's associates controlled, a place where men like him didn't get out on bail and didn't get to seek revenge. Michael was ensuring the family was never hunted again, cutting every thread that connected their trauma to their future. As the vans began to pull away, leaving the house silent once more, Michael walked back to the sofa. He looked at the expensive Italian leather of his shoes, now scuffed and stained with the reality of the night. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver coin, a weight he'd carried as a reminder of his brother. He placed it in Ollie's hand. "This is for luck," Michael said, his voice low and steady. "But you won't need it. People are going to come by tomorrow to move you to a new place. A safe place. You won't ever have to look at this hallway again." Ollie gripped the coin, his eyes searching Michael's face. "Are you a ghost?" the boy asked. Michael felt a ghost of a smile tug at the corner of his mouth, the first in a long time. "No, Ollie. Not anymore." He stood up and walked toward the door. The cleanup was complete. The evidence of the violence would be vanished, replaced by the quiet hum of a secured life. Michael Ward walked out into the pre-dawn chill, the iron fist relaxing at last, knowing that for the first time in his life, he hadn't just finished a contract. He had settled a debt. The sun was a bruised purple smudge on the horizon by the time Michael returned to his penthouse. The glass cathedral was exactly as he had left it, silent, sterile, and bathed in the pale, unforgiving light of dawn. He shed his tactical vest, the heavy ceramic plates hitting the marble floor with a final, echoing thud. He didn't reach for the scotch this time. Instead, he stepped out onto the balcony, the cold morning air rushing to meet him like a long-overdue confession. High above the city, the world looked different. The streets below were beginning to pulse with the first signs of life, a sprawling grid of millions of souls, each one a potential target or a potential victim. For years, Michael had looked down at this view and seen only a battlefield, a place to navigate with a cold heart and a closed fist. He had believed that safety was found in distance, that if he climbed high enough and felt little enough, the ghosts of his past couldn't reach him. He looked at his hands, resting on the cold steel of the railing. They were still the hands of a mercenary, scarred and capable of terrible things. But the tremor that had lived in his marrow since his brother's death was gone. The thick walls had been replaced by something sturdier, a sense of direction. He realized now that his skills weren't a curse or a mark of a broken man, they were a tool. He had spent his life being a weapon for profit, but in 2 minutes of a rainy night, he had become a shield for the sake of a promise. He thought of Ollie, safe now in a sanitized room, protected by an invisible fortress of wealth and watchmen. He thought of the trusting eyes that had looked at him not with fear, but with the recognition of a savior. In saving that boy, Michael had finally allowed himself to be found. The "love nothing, feel nothing" mantra that had been his oxygen for 20 years was a lie. It hadn't been a shield, it had been a shroud. As the first true ray of sunlight caught the glass of the skyscrapers, Michael felt a strange, quiet warmth radiating from his chest. It was the realization that even the most broken hearts can heal, not through the absence of pain, but through the presence of purpose. Protection wasn't just about the violence he could inflict on monsters, it was about the peace he could provide to the innocent. He wasn't the ghost in the suit anymore. He was something older, something more primal. The city hummed beneath him, a living, breathing thing. He knew there were other closets, other shadows, and other monsters who thought they were the apex of the night. He also knew he would be watching. He wouldn't be hiding in his marble tomb any longer. Michael Ward turned away from the view and walked back into his home. The penthouse didn't feel cold anymore, it felt like a command center. He picked up the burner phone, his movements fluid and at peace. He wasn't waiting for a debt to be called in. He was waiting for a plea. He was the guardian now, and the night finally belonged to him.